Hello everybody, welcome back to the third and last of our videos looking at the topic of homelessness and homelessness services. I mentioned in my first video I worked in the area of homelessness services myself, my first work in the area of social care. So I have a particular passion for this topic. I want to reflect a little bit on the workplace in this final video in our series and this course actually. The different services. What different services do homeless people use? And which other overlapping social work services are used by homeless people? So think about all of the services, professionals they have contact with in a typical week or month. What kind of services can we list? And I should warn you, on my next slide, I have something like 10 or 12. What did you come up with? What kind of services did you manage to list? We've got short-term, medium-term and long-term accommodation. The most basic service, of course, is the housing one, isn't it? Housing associations are the typical solution there in the UK context. We've got street work, we've got outreach work, again, a real classic old social work method. There's also places where homeless people can go to hang out, spend time, drop-in centres, cafes. Typically you get the cafe facility, but also the advice possibilities. You can make maybe a first contact with professionals. These are often in the voluntary sector, typically run by charities, sometimes even done by church charities. You've got food banks. When I was a kid, the food bank scene was much more compact. In austerity Britain, maybe linked also to neoliberalism, the precariousness of everyday life, food banks have become a really important part of lives for a great chunk of the population. So that's obviously a really big service that people will be accessing regularly. If you don't have cooking facilities, the soup kitchen, again, a classic social work offer, that's obviously going to be part of your life. Drug and alcohol advice services. Not all homeless people would be using alcohol or drugs, but some do. I could list here a few. You've got needle exchanges. In some countries, such as Germany, you have consumption rooms where I can take the illegal drugs that I'm buying on the streets and take them safely under medical supervision. You've got drug and alcohol rehabilitation services, for example. The latter, of course, is linked in with the psychiatric system normally. Psychiatric services, obviously, low threshold healthcare services, so easy ways to access healthcare. There's often little outreach clinics in big urban centres specialising in delivering healthcare to homeless people. You've got lots of services linked to money, benefits advice, debt counselling, even legal advocacy as it's needed. And of course, we've also got the probation service for criminal justice services, which also overlap a little with our homelessness scene. I worked with homeless people for something like 3 years in total, and I had contact with almost each one of these services at one point in my work or another. So there really is a whole network of interrelating services, and many of our clients will have contact with more than one or two of these. I've already mentioned I worked in homelessness services. It's an interesting question to ask why. Why are some people attracted to working in this sector, working with the homeless? Why? Why do they do it? What are they getting out of it? Why is the work for them interesting? Why do they find the work rewarding? Once again, pause the video, natter with your partner. What did you come up with? There's a whole bunch of reasons. This doesn't seem to be written down anywhere, but from my own experiences and thinking of my colleagues, I think we can collect the reasons why we were attracted to the work. It's a chance to help somebody turn around their life. If you manage to do that, it's very satisfying. When you start your job working with the homeless, that's obviously a dream you have, helping people to really make that change in their life, to turn their life around 180 degrees. Of course, in reality, it doesn't happen as the naive young worker plans, but you may have these successes from time to time, which give you a boost, which give you the energy. It's an opportunity to make a small difference in a stressful or painful life, and that's a much more everyday work pleasure. All going well, you might have that feeling of helping in some small incremental way quite a lot in your everyday working life, making a small difference to somebody in considerable difficulties. I enjoyed the work because you have lots of time to talk to people. I can still remember conversations I had. Now, my work experience here was in the late 1990s. This is like 20, 22 years ago. But quite amazingly, I can really remember the things I said to people, the things that people told me, people's personal stories, even jokes that people told me 20 years ago. A lot of it's still hanging on in my mind. So that's something very, very nice. Lots of friendly interactions. A few reasons, though, that I must add to the list are maybe more problematic, more negative. Are we attracted to this work on the edge, on the margins? Are we attracted to it because it somehow gives us compensation for our own difficulties, our own issues? I asked myself if that was the case with me. Maybe it was to some extent, certainly. Other problematic reasons, there's definitely some people that do it for, it's a vulgar way to say it, but in the sense there's a soul-saving scene out there. Common in particular the faith-based agencies, but also you get it in the secular, the statutory settings too. So in a sense, we want to save people, we want to rescue people. That's another word we can use. We want to rescue people. The homelessness houses kind of evolved out of rescue houses in earlier times. An interesting question, what about these extreme experiences of the client? When you're a young worker working in the sector, you don't really have your own life experience. And then you're working with people that have these very, very brutal and traumatic life experiences, people that make these extreme experiences for themselves. So is it somehow an extreme experience for the worker to have contact to that world? And if so, is it in some way voyeuristic? As you can see, I'm a little bit ambivalent, and I'm asking myself what attracted me to that work back then when I did it when I was younger, 20, 22 years ago. Hold on to these points because it's the reality of the workplace. And it really is a challenging workplace. Undoubtedly, this is a hard and a demanding place to do social work or social care. In what way? My next task for you, what difficulties, what challenges does the setting of homelessness services, what challenges does it bring for the worker? Why is it difficult? Why is it challenging? I want you to collect points. I want you to collect points under particular headings, okay? Use the following headings. Number one, problems related to helping the client group, problems related to helping the homeless people. Two, problems related to controlling the group, problems related to controlling the homeless people. Point three, problems related to the economics, the business and the management side of services. And finally, category four, problems related to the human resources and the staff needs. Okay, it's a particular place to work with particular stresses for staff, for the workers. And that's with your neighbour. And for each one of these four categories, try to find a couple of bullet points if you can. My first category was this idea of caring difficulties, helping difficulties, difficulty in helping clients change their lives when their problems are deeply ingrained. Often when I was a worker in the homelessness setting, I was envious of friends who were working in, say, medicine. A broken arm will probably heal itself in the next 3 weeks. But the people I was working with, their problems really were deep, profound, and they weren't going to change their lives in 3 weeks. In 3 weeks' time, their problems were still going to be quite grave, quite serious. So it really is a challenge to actually help people to turn around their lives. Their problems, are not on the surface. Their problems are much deeper down. They have emotional distress. It's really a part of that scene. These are people having difficult emotional experiences. They're having emotional difficulties. There's a lot of trauma out there. So as a worker, you've got to be able to hold that emotional distress, somehow contain that emotional distress. And that's a challenge. Another difficulty, some clients may be hard to form a caring relationship with. Sometimes it's easy, but sometimes it's much harder to form that caring relationship. Their behaviours may be hurtful. And sometimes this is even because of a medical disorder. One or two of the people I had contact with had a very rare disorder called the dissocial personality disorder. You find it quite a lot in forensic psychiatry. And such people may be quite hard to bind with. They are by their very nature difficult people to form relationships with. And there's this interest in caring, you as a worker, it's the caring aspect of your job, which really is what attracts you to a job. But that has to be balanced with a mandate from outside, because society wants you to control these guys. Society is not really interested in helping these guys. These guys get very little help. They're in a difficult situation in society, and society's mandate for you is actually to control them, to restrict them, to check them, to monitor them, not necessarily to help them. So it's that typical idea of the dual mandate of social work and social care. So caring difficulties. Controlling difficulties, the last point, takes us to our next category. You have little knowledge of your clients' lives and the risks around your clients. Sometimes you may be asked to fill in a risk assessment, but you invariably don't have enough information to actually complete that risk assessment. So a lack of knowledge. I worked as a volunteer in an emergency night shelter. We would actually formally ask for the people coming on their first night with us, where were you last night? And the answers you'd get, oh, in prison, or in another hostel, which I was asked to leave from. And you're asking yourself why. So there's risk there, and it's very hard to measure. And you're getting these behaviors which are risky behaviors. These are places where people will experience violence. There's going to be harmful illicit drug use. I remember one of my first shifts in an emergency night shelter. I had to get a bedroom ready, and the worker said to me, "Have you done this before?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Okay, thick plastic gloves. When you change the bedding, be careful, there may be needles there." So this is a dangerous workplace to be. There's harmful, risky behaviors here. You're witnessing illegal activities. That's kind of part of the job. Which I might ask. Don't pause. I mean, you're getting the usual ones. You're witnessing drug use. You might realize that there's drugs being sold. Obviously, you don't want to get involved in that. You might be aware of various things happening around you. Maybe you're aware of violence, for example. So that's very problematic. Typically, these night shelters, typically homeless accommodation, has inadequate space. We don't have as much space as we need. So, for example, in your classic night shelter, you'll have room sharing. It'd be lovely to put all the clients into separate rooms. They need that, but that's not the reality. Community relations are difficult. For example, relationships with the neighbors. That's a difficult part of the work, excuse me. And it really is worth stressing here, worth underlining, our clients, they belong to the most stigmatized in society. They are society's most vulnerable and most stigmatized. Nobody wants to hang out with these guys. And if you're their worker, you're almost carrying the stigma that they carry. So there's that idea in social work. One of my colleagues talks about social workers being stigmatized by association with the stigmatized. What was our third category? Our third category, I invited you to think about economics and the management difficulties. Once again here, limited financial resources. We're not a popular kind of workplace. This is not the client group which everybody wants to throw money and resources at. So as a manager, you may find that the financial resources are on the limited side. Precarious finance, you're dependent, for example, on charitable donations very, very often. And you get these charitable donations in times of economic boom. In times of economic recession, suddenly your funding dries up. So that's very frustrating. Staff teams, often a funny kind of mix. You may have unqualified workers. I did this work before getting my social work qualifications. So I wasn't really qualified to do the job. You also have unqualified volunteers, working without pay next to paid workers. So, the staff team is often a difficult constellation to juggle with. You can have high staff and volunteer turnover because of the stresses of the workplace. You're constantly inducting new volunteers, new workers. My final category was human resources and staff difficulties. What can we list here? High supervision needs. This is really one of the most emotional, one of the most stressful social care workplaces. And as a worker, I really needed supervision. I'm not sure if in reality people get it as much as they need it. We've just noted this is an area of social care with less financial resources. Low pay, low status, compare it to, say, a German Jugendamt or Children's Services Department. This is not a high status statutory part of social work and social care. Tends to be very much, run by voluntary sector organisations. The emotional stresses on the worker when confronted with clients' biographies and trauma, as a worker, I've already mentioned this, you have to contain that, you have to be able to hold that. You'll bring back some of those stories at the end of a hard day at work. It will stay in your head, it will stop you sleeping. I've already mentioned the riskiness of the working environment. There's real health and safety questions here. Poor boundaries. If you work with homeless people and you're on your day off and you're walking around town, you'll bump into your clients. They may be there begging or doing their thing. They might say hello to you. They might not even recognize you. I've had that experience too. Negotiating this care control balance, again, that dual mandate issue, that's also a question we have in our minds the whole time. And it goes without saying, burnout is a relatively high risk in this sector. And I was often meeting people that had worked in this sector for a few years, maybe 5, maybe 10. I met very few people that had worked their whole life in homelessness services. It's one of the more challenging settings to work long term. My own work experience of homeless people was actually in a particular sector. Initially, my first job was with young homeless people, and I'd like to close this presentation by looking a little bit at the specific group of homeless people and maybe why they're different or why they're vulnerable more so than other homeless people. Youth homelessness services, it's a subcategory of homelessness services. How would you define it? What are youth homelessness services? Or what is a youth homeless person? Any ideas? Natter once again with your partner. You may have struggled a little bit. There's definitely conflicting ideas here, but are problems defining this concept? It's hard to define. Each country has a different definition. Many European countries have mechanisms in place to avoid children becoming homeless. By definition, a child cannot be homeless. So in many countries, you'll rule out the idea of under 18s. So the definition will start at the age of, say, 18, going up to, 26, 27, 30. It depends on the country in question. Some countries acknowledge that under 18-year-old homeless people, that does exist de facto. It's there, even if we don't really accept it, because of people, drifting through the system. Fianza, which I mentioned in my last presentation, that they use an earlier age because of this. So they have a rather, a realist perspective here, looking at it pragmatically. They say youth homelessness occurs when an individual between the age of 13 and 26 is experiencing rooflessness or houselessness, or is living in insecure or inadequate housing without a parent, family member, or other legal guardian. So you have to read that to get your head around it. But of course, they're referring to their framework for categorizing homelessness. They have this broad definition of homelessness, as well as the rooflessness and the houselessness, but they also include insecure and inadequate housing. So basically, they're using their own understanding of homelessness, adding the age range, 13 to 26, and noting it's without that parent or guardian with them. So certainly a workable definition there. Youth homelessness, particular contexts, particular issues. Young people, obviously they're different from adults. These young people and young adults are different from older people. They have a particular vulnerability because of their age. Which issues are particularly important for young homeless people? Assume we're thinking about homeless people aged 18 plus here. So what issues are particularly important? To help with your task, consider working with the people that I worked with. I was with 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. What kind of issues are big in their lives? Once again, pause, natter with your partner. What can we say? What are the key issues for these young homeless people? Vulnerability, the vulnerability of youth. We're in a transition period, aren't we? A transition period to adulthood. You've got a neuroscience component of that. We understand how the brain works. Young people, youth, they have different brains from older adults. They're cognitively, they're not yet adults. There's still development in the brain. So we have genetic neuroscience aspects. We've got the economic vulnerability of youth. Young people don't earn as much as older adults, do they? So they're going to have less money to pay rent and so on. All these questions of dependence, independence. Young people by definition are dependent on others, and in these people's biographies they were presumably until recently dependent on their family. Now they're independent, you know, so that's a very abrupt transition. Usually with young people that's a much more gradual process. Care leavers, many young homeless people have experience of the care system. They were in care at some point within their childhood. The questions around schooling: is their education complete? Did they leave school with qualifications? If not, do they want to go back and catch up on those qualifications missed? And this transition to employment, you know, is it going smoothly? That was a key concern for many of the young homeless people I worked with. Youth as a life phase, you know, you've got that energy, the Sturm und Drang of youth. You're experimenting with things like substance use, sexuality, relationships. You know, this is a time of trying things out. And there's all kinds of human rights issues, especially with under 18-year-old homeless people, but also that youth phase in general. There's a whole bunch of human rights issues around the very fact that they are homeless in society. So a real range of issues for young people. And again, if you want to read more about this, there's a lovely recent paper which I'm recommending at the end of the presentation. It's a rather gloomy topic, isn't it? You know, I've talked about working with very vulnerable people. I've talked about very emotional and difficult work. Maybe it's nice for me to leave this presentation with something maybe to sweeten it a little bit. And I've got a lovely video that I stumbled across by chance recently, and it really moved me. And it's a very serious video about a very serious topic, youth homelessness. And yet the video has a really lovely conclusion, a lovely ending. So maybe it's a nice way of ending this particular presentation. I'd like to draw your attention to this video. It's made by The Guardian together with the homelessness charity Centrepoint. They've produced a series of videos. This is one of them, and I can really recommend it. So I hope you enjoy that viewing. Let me come to a close now. Thanks a lot for watching this video. Thanks a lot for participating in this course. Cheerio.